Take a quick break, and after this, we'll have another interview. It's a busy one this morning.
Good morning. Please mute your microphone.
Based on our opinions on the new day and what's the plan, around the game plan. So I'll assume we stick to the squad which we had based on the game plan that we.
Good morning all. So we're now starting the second session of our SAMM course on media training, promoting a positive image of migrants and recognizing their contribution to development in the SADC region. So today, our two sessions, they're going to be related to two stories that tell the contribution of migrants to development. So both of them are going to be related to this topic. And so we're going to have two parts. But before that, I would like to quickly show you eCampus. That's the electronic platform that's being used in the course. And also to do a very brief exercise with you related to the session we had on Monday. So and after that, we're going to start the first part with a presentation and questions, answers, and discussions. So for presenting you eCampus, I'm going to share my screen now. And just a moment. Okay, so I think you can see my screen, all right? So this is the main panel of eCampus. After logging in, you're going to come here. This is the region we have for all courses related to labor migration in the SADC region. So this is the 5th course we're having on the top. So this page is dedicated for all courses of the SAMM project. And basically what we're going to have here, when you open, you're going to have tabs on the top with information about the SAMM project, and also who are the people who are taking the course, including the experts, the tutors. And here in the tab course, we're going to have the blocks that present information about the course itself. So, and since we use this page for different courses, we have a common area on the top that has useful information and that's valid for all SAMM projects. Here you can know more about the project, you can meet the experts, you can also know who are the people who are part of the ITCLO team, who are the people who are managing the SAMM projects. We have frequently asked questions, and so it's a broad introductory block. And after, we're going to have specific blocks for the courses. So if you had more than one course in the related to the SAMM project, you are going to see a specific block for each one of the courses you had. But talking about our specific course here, the media training, this is the block where we're going to find all the information about this course. So that's the most important thing that you have to know, that you have to come to this block here, and you are going to open the block, and here we're going to find all information specifically about this course, starting with a welcome video. We have here the description of the course, the agenda, what you have to do to get the certification. You have the pre-readings. You have descriptions about everything that's happening in this course. We have also the virtual coffee place. You have received a message earlier this week inviting you to discussions.
Hello. I can't hear anything from the side.
Sorry? Is there a problem or it's all fine? I guess it's all fine. So just continue. So you have received the invitation earlier this week to join the forum, the discussion forum. So that's the space where you can post your doubts and you can discuss with other people about what's happening here, share your examples. So this complements the webinars and the discussions we have in the webinar, since we don't have time to go sometimes to go through the whole topic. So it's we have the forum where we can keep the discussions, to continue discussions virtually. And one very important also thing that I want to show.
Hello. I can't hear anything from this. The voice is not audible. I can't hear.
So one last thing that you have to understand here is the part where we're going to find the recordings of the webinars and the presentations. That's some sessions here. So basically, you have to go here, and you're going to find one topic here for each one of the sessions. And when you click on it, you are going to see here the presentations, and also you're going to see here the videos, the video recordings from the previous sessions. So that's a very important part of eCampus that you have to be aware of. And so with that, I finish my introduction of eCampus to you, and I would like now to go to our brief exercise that's going to be about last sessions, the session we had on Monday. And what I would like to ask you is to very quickly to write in the chat box one thing that you have learned in our session of Monday. So basically something that has attracted your attention during the last webinar, something that you didn't know before, and something that you remember for a long time. So I would like to ask each one of you to think a little bit about that and to write in the chat box what was the most important thing that you have learned in our last webinar. So that's the challenge. So I will just give you like 2 minutes for that. Just a quick check. Are you having any trouble to hear me?
I think you're fine, Fernando.
Is it fine? Okay, very good. Okay, so apparently we didn't have any reaction here. So I would like let's continue our session, and I would like to start the first block of today's session. That's going to be about recognizing migrants' contributions to development, finding a story. So for this first part, we're going to have a presentation from Vincent, and after we're going to have a second presentation from Theo. Theo is a senior labor migrant specialist at ILO Pretoria. So he's going to, you haven't talked to him yet. So, but you know Vincent from the first session. So today in our first part, we're going to have both Vincent and Theo, and also Charles, who is going to participate in the conversation. So now I give the floor to Vincent, who is going to present to you to make the first presentation. So you have the floor, Vincent.
Thank you very much, Fernando, and good morning, colleagues. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning following our session on Monday. And may I also just say a very warm greeting to Theo. We've been connected over the last year or so, and we haven't spoken for several months. So good morning, Theo, especially to you. I thought that for this morning, it would be helpful in discussing the topic, recognizing the contribution of migration to development, to really talk broadly about migration dynamics in the SADC region. Just to say that I think that for us to really think about how we can facilitate and how we can maximize the contribution of migration to development, a key part of that is understanding the nature and the dynamics of migration. I've been involved with a few other people in doing research on migration in the SADC region, but also more broadly linked to what is referred to as south migration. So in other words, migration between developing countries. And it's important for us, if we're looking at the linkages with development in countries of origin and countries of destination, that we understand what the picture of migration looks like. So I thought I'd start there this morning, and then towards the end of my presentation, look more specifically at the development-related issues that we need to be aware of. And so part of the storytelling that we need to do requires the context. So what do we know about migration within the SADC region, and what does it look like? So yeah, and then it's really just for all of us to understand, when we look at migration in the region, what do we see in terms of the dynamics? And once we understand and know the dynamics of migration, how do we manage migration in such a way so we can facilitate a positive impact on development? This is not statistics about who's migrating, where they're going, what the numbers are, but it's really about the broader characteristics of the types of migration that we see in the region. So the first thing is that based on our research, we know that migration in the region tends to be less selective, and less selective here means limited opportunity. So it's not that migrants will choose, we want to go and work in this sector, or we're going to that country or to this particular country, but it's really that the opportunities are restricted, so that migrants often do not have the real opportunity to make broad choices about where to migrate to, which jobs to take, and so on. We also know that it's more temporary, and a lot of this has to do with the way in which migration in the region has been organized for decades. So migrant workers tend to get shorter-term labor contracts, so there's no such thing. Particularly for most migrants, there are exceptions, of course, but for most migrants, the labor contracts are a year, maybe it's for 6 months, it's often seasonal and so on. And that, of course, assumes that they do have labor contracts. Often they don't actually have contracts. And that results in a high turnover of migrants. And so we see a constant flow of migrants for the purpose of employment. And the jobs are very unstable. And this, of course, is linked to a number of other factors, which I will talk about a little bit later. And what that means is that very few migrants actually have the opportunity to become citizens of the country that they migrate to, partly because it's very difficult to become citizens, but also because of the nature of the work that they're doing. The residency, so they will usually stay in the country in which they're working while they are working, but then they're required to return home. So even permanent residence for most of the migrants in the region becomes quite difficult. And what that then means is that migrants, whether they're male or female migrants, and let me just say that we have been seeing an increase in female migration over the last 15 years to 20 years or so. But migrants generally do not have the opportunity to take their families with them and so on. And here, and we talked a little bit about this on Monday, but here we obviously have to make a distinction between the more professional, what we refer to as highly skilled migrants, and the migrants in low-wage sectors, or what we also sometimes talk about as low-skilled migrants. And so there clearly is a difference in terms of opportunities for citizenship, residence, and family reunification. But for most migrants, because their contracts are temporary, those opportunities don't really exist for them. And then one of the difficulties is when migrants then return home, the challenges of reintegrating them in their home countries. And here, a particular and very specific example is the mining industry. And in South Africa, where a lot of mine workers will spend on temporary contracts every year, they will come and work on the mines. And then eventually when they reach retirement age or when they get ill and no longer able to work, they return home. And it's quite difficult for many of them to be reintegrated into their home countries. And so reintegration should, when we're thinking about migration and development, one of the areas that we need to look at is how are migrants reintegrated into their own societies and into their own communities. The second one, and I think this is pretty obvious given that we're talking about migration in the region, is that migration distances are fairly short. So migrants tend to go to the other neighboring countries. And in the report that we did for the SAMM project, we provide the statistics of the countries that migrants come from, the countries that they go to. But within the region, there is significant migration between neighboring countries. And a lot of that has to do with the historical, the cultural, and the language affinities. So it's a lot easier for a migrant to move from one English-speaking country in SADC to another English-speaking country in SADC. Often in pre-colonial times, when the borders didn't exist, those migrants were part of the communities that currently exists across borders. So there's a lot of connection between migrants between different countries, and so migrants find it relatively easy to adapt to the countries that they migrate to. We have seen a more significant interest in bilateral labor agreements. Many of them don't exist yet, but they certainly talk between many countries in the region to establish bilateral labor agreements so that they can facilitate migration. And of course, because you're not traveling long distances, the investment in migration can be, in many cases, can be less costly. Some of it has to do with weaker border controls, and here, particularly when we talk about migrants in an irregular situation, and we know some of the stories about migrants crossing rivers, migrants jumping fences, and so on. So weaker border controls do contribute to irregular migration, and we know that. What we don't know is the extent to which that might happen, or we don't know it as clearly as I think we should. But then in many cases, even though immigration policies are largely restrictive, historically, the background to immigration policies is that they were designed actually to keep people out rather than to facilitate migration. But even though they might be restrictive, it's often inadequately enforced. And a lot of this has to do, or some of this at least, has to do with corruption and bribery at border posts, turning a blind eye to irregular migration and so on. But the point I'm making here is that within the SADC region, there's a lot of migration that is happening. And in fact, it probably exceeds, if I remember correctly, it exceeds migration to other parts of the continent or other parts of the world. And so when we're talking migration and development, what we have to take into account is most migrants actually go to neighboring countries or other countries within the region. It's important to understand who's migrating. And here we often talk about, for the best part, it is people who are poorer and people who are so-called lower skilled. So in other words, they may not have a professional qualification, they may not have a lot of education and so on. And as we said on Monday, this does not necessarily make them lower skilled. It just means that they do not have the academic and professional qualifications that we usually link to high skilled migration. And so we often talk about the migration of the poor and migration as a survival strategy. So a lot of people leave their own countries to look for opportunities in another country because that's the means that they have available for them to survive. Many of them have a limited earning capacity and therefore end up, because they do not have the professional and academic qualifications, they do end up in the low wage sectors, such as you see, the agriculture, construction, services, and services here refers to restaurants, hotels, and so on, domestic work. And those sectors do tend to be labor intensive. Many of them tend to be less regulated. It does create more opportunities for lower skilled migrants. It does create more opportunities for irregular migration as well. And of course, that then heightens the possibilities of exploitation and abuse because it is not so well regulated. And the linkage we make here is that in a lot of those sectors where migrants work, if they were more regulated, if more attention was paid to issues of exploitation and abuse, if more attention was paid to the conditions in which migrants live and so on, that may have a much more positive impact on development. But it's understanding that while we do have more professional and more qualified migrants in the health sector, in the education sector, in the financial sector, and so on, moving in the region as well, the majority of migrants will fall into the category of lower skilled migrants. I made this point already, but we have related to who the migrants are is the fact that we do have the phenomenon of irregular and undocumented migration, and linked to that is migrant smuggling. And so this, you would know, means that migrants are assisted to travel across borders without documentation, or they are issued documents, false documents, and so on in order to travel. Illegal entry and stay. Often these are blown out of proportion. So we get told that there are millions and millions of so-called illegal migrants in particular countries, but it's something that's quite difficult to verify. That's not to say that it does not happen. We do know that it does happen. And so it's an important part of thinking or rethinking our approach to migration and thinking about, for a lot of these people, why is it possible for them to move to another country, to be able to find a job, to stay in the country for a period of time? Does that suggest that they actually need it in specific sectors, so such as agriculture, or such as construction, or such as domestic work? And if they are needed, so in other words, if countries need migrant workers in those sectors, why is it that they resort to illegal entry or illegally staying in a particular country? And just as an interesting bit of information, several years ago, we actually did some research where we were trying to understand the motivation of migrants and why it is that many of them were undocumented or in an irregular situation. And the feedback we got from migrants themselves is that they would actually prefer, if they could get the proper documentation, they would prefer to cross borders in a regular manner. They would prefer to have the necessary work permits and so on. But that in many cases, it's relatively difficult for them to do so. And a lot of the migrants were saying, often they feel they do not have a choice but to be in an irregular situation in the manner in which they cross borders or in the work and stay in the country of destination. So all of this, as I said earlier, creates a lot of vulnerability. And so one of the areas of focus of the SAMM project is what are the vulnerabilities that migrants are confronted with? What kind of mechanisms do we need to put in place to protect vulnerable migrants? And here we will talk about victims of trafficking. We're talking about asylum seekers and refugees. We're talking about children and so on. But an important part of this is as well is how does vulnerability impact on development? So if we're not taking care of specific groups of migrants, asylum seekers and refugees, victims of trafficking, what sort of climate, what sort of environment does this create, and how does this impact on potential for development? Just, I think, as I said earlier, irregular or undocumented migration in many cases can be difficult to quantify. We do have some statistics, and they usually come from visa overstay statistics or deportation statistics and so on. But part of what we need to do is move away from this idea, this perception that most migrants or all migrants are irregular or undocumented, because we do not actually have, in most cases, we do not actually have the evidence to quantify the numbers that are being provided. So let's just look at some of the key issues related to migration and development, because this in the regional context are some of the things that we need to be thinking about if we are serious about maximizing the impact of migration to development. And so the first key issue for me is the levels of equality and income. And so we know that particularly in the more unregulated sectors, and also because of the poor enforcement of labor market regulations or labor market policies, in many cases, the income of migrants is generally lower, right? And so again, they work in the low wage sectors. Many do so for the purpose of survival. And so a lot of the time, migrants themselves, even though they may be aware that their wages are lower, the income is lower than their citizen counterparts, many of them will accept it because that's they need it in order to survive. And the consequence of that is that there is little significant long-term development impact for the migrants themselves. So where the levels of income are low, we see little significant long-term impact because the income is used for survival purposes. But that does not mean that individuals and households do not benefit. And so a lot of the survival strategy engaged in by migrants is to increase the number of people in their family to migrate. So the more people migrate and earn income, even though the individual income might be low, cumulatively, it does have a benefit for the household and in many cases for communities as well. But one of the interesting things that we see, and in some, for example, in a particular village or in a particular community, you have high levels of outward migration. And that also means that you then have higher levels of income within particular families. And that may increase the levels of inequality in the community. So if some families or if some households have access to remittances, whether in cash or in kind, and other households do not in the country of origin, you may see increases or increasing levels of inequality in a particular community. And that, of course, has implications for development. In terms of the country of destination, we also see higher levels of inequality. And we often see what the trade union movements refer to as a two-tier labor market. So in other words, you have one set of wages that is being wages, working conditions, social protection systems that apply to citizens, and you have a different set of rules and regulations that are informally being applied to migrant workers. And we then see higher levels of inequality in the destination countries between local workers and migrant workers. But we also see higher levels of competition in the destination countries. And so migrants, as I said earlier, a significant number of migrants are relatively poor. They need the income to survive. But when they go to the countries of destination, they're actually competing in many cases with the citizens who are equally poor, equally need to find jobs. And so while it's not correct and it's not appropriate to accuse migrants of taking jobs as a blanket thing, we do know that there's at least a perception, and in some cases there is the reality of competition for jobs between migrants and local workers. And of course, this has to be addressed, because if there are negative social dynamics and negative social interaction between migrants and locals, that is going to have an impact on socioeconomic development in the country of destination as well, because it gets disrupted by social disorder and social destabilization. One of the key areas, and this is one that's been focused on globally in terms of the impact of migration and development, is that of remittances. This is about migrants sending money back home, or as I said earlier, sometimes buying goods in the country of destination and then sending the goods back home. Just given that migrants in the region generally do not earn, the majority of migrants generally do not have a high income, the amounts that they send home tend to be smaller amounts. So if we look at global figures, comparatively smaller amounts. But we do know that some countries, even though the amounts from individual migrants may be small, we do know that some countries are somewhat dependent on the cumulative remittances being sent by migrants. And here, for example, if we look at a country like Lesotho, where a significant part of Lesotho's GDP actually comes from migrant remittances through the deferred payment system from mine workers in South Africa. We also do know that remittances in the region, a lot of remittances, historically, the process for remitting has been less regulated and a lot more informal. That is getting a little bit better. A lot of banks have realized the potential for formalizing remittance structures and remittance processes, but we still see a lot of unregulated informal remittances. So you give goods or money to a family member that is traveling back home. The long distance minibus taxi industry is involved in remittances where they get the amount of money, they get the address where the money must go to, and they get paid for their service and so on. Because it's for survival purposes, remittances are often used for consumptive as opposed to productive purposes. And what this means is that the money is used to buy food, the money is used to maintain the household and so on. And so it's often, as soon as the money arrives in the country of destination, country of origin, and the family receives it, they spend the money because they need to spend it in order to survive. But we do have examples where remittances are used for productive purposes. So rather than spend the money on food, there might be an investment in education, or there might be an investment in agricultural tools, which then will obviously have a benefit in the longer term. But also investment in education, also investment in healthcare, which of course, the more educated, the healthier your population, the more likely it is that they can engage in more productive activities, which ultimately will lead to either local development or in some cases development more broadly. As I indicated earlier, remittances are often in kind, and here we see migrant workers using the money, buying in the country of destination, and then sending the goods back home as opposed to sending the cash back home. That sometimes has to do with the availability of those sorts of goods in the countries of origin, but it is often a way of making sure that the family is taken care of because they are receiving goods from the migrants. Because if, as I said, historically, remittances have used informal channels, or one of the reasons why we've seen remittances using informal channels is because formal channels tend to be quite expensive. You need to open a bank account, or you need to have access to a service that can transfer the money for you and so on. As I say, we are actually seeing changes in this regard with mobile phones being able to use to transfer money without needing access to a bank account. But usually formal channels for remittances are quite expensive. And given that the income of migrants is generally low anyway, they're not going to spend a lot of money on sending remittances back home. But we do know, and migrants themselves will tell the story, that remittances contribute to the well-being of the immediate family, and in some cases, the well-being of the communities that migrants come from. One of the issues that again is talked about a lot in terms of the impact of migration on countries of origin is the issue of the brain drain. And this is about the skilled professionals that are leaving their countries of origin and then usually settling for long-term, or in some cases permanently settling in the countries of destination. Now, we do know that brain drain happens in the region, and we just have to look around in certain sectors. So particularly if we look at the health sectors, if we look at the financial sector in the region, you often find that it is migrants who occupy significant positions in those companies. But actually, we do not know enough about brain drain within the region. So I'm saying here that as far as we know, brain drain within the region is quite limited, but that may just have to do with the fact that we do not know enough about it. A lot of the research in brain drain tends to be from the countries in the region to Europe, to North America, and so on. We also know that some of the research that's been done, a lot of the information that has emerged needs to be verified. So for example, we did some research looking from South Africa, looking at people leaving on a long-term or permanent basis, what we skilled professionals leaving for on a long-term or permanent basis. So classic brain drain, but we were looking at Canada, we were looking at the US, we were looking at Australia. And there's a huge mismatch between the numbers reported by South Africa and the numbers reported by the countries of destination. And that is because people often don't declare their intention to relocate permanently. So they may not, when they declare the reason for leaving the country, they often don't say it's because we have another job and we're settling in another country. But what we do know, so in other words, our knowledge base about brain drain within the region needs to be developed. We need a lot more work to be done on that. But what we do know is that brain drain can and does have a negative impact on the development in countries of origin. So if all your professional health workers, or significant part of your health workers, a significant number of educators, a significant number of people in your financial sector and other economic sectors are actually leaving to go and work in another country, the skills base in the country of origin is decreased. And so you do not have the necessary skills in order to really work on development in the country of origin. But of course, it has the opposite impact on countries of destination. So as more and more skilled professionals migrate, that has a more positive impact on the country of destination. But the point here is, we know it's happening, but my sense is we do not know enough about the brain drain within the SADC region. And then just the fourth one, something that we often overlook in terms of development, is how migration also impact on the culture and so social behavior in both countries of origin and countries of destination. So in countries of origin, we often talk about social remittances, right? Social remittances meaning that migrants learn new ways of behavior, they understand particular situations in a different way because they're living in a different society. And a lot of their behavior, a lot of their thinking, a lot of their perception when they go back home is transferred back home. And here, for example, we can think about gender roles. Here, for example, we can think about gender roles where maybe in the country of destination, the role of women in particular would be seen to be restricted to certain activities. When those women migrate and they go and live and work in another country, they learn new ideas about gender roles and gender interaction, and they may take some of those ideas back home, which could have both a negative and or a positive impact depending on the situation. But we do know that the behavior and norms of migrants are affected by and impacted on by the process of migration. But it obviously depends on the country of origin and destination. So if if a person migrates to a country that is very similar in terms of cultural and social dynamics, obviously that's not going to have a huge impact. But linked to that is also the transfer of knowledge and ideas. So in both directions. So migrants going to a country of destination bring with them knowledge and they bring with them ideas, but migrants returning from a country of destination, will take ideas back home with them. There's a sense, and this has been talked about for a long time, that all of this, what we see in the region, may have contributed to a culture of migration. So in other words, migration in the region is not something unusual. It's not something that people have difficulty in relating to because it's happened for so long and because so many countries and so many people are involved in this process, that migration is actually part of the culture of the region. And I'll end in a few minutes. But let's just think about some of the opportunities and challenges. So here again, our focus is on how do we think about the contribution of migration to development? What's there that may make it easier or may make it more difficult? So we do know that migrants and migration can and do contribute to poverty reduction and development. And I've talked about remittances, skills and knowledge. In the country of destination, migrants pay for services, right? And so the contribution to the tax base or the income base in the country of destination is something that is important. They pay rent, they buy food, they pay for other services and so on. We also see in some cases that migrants invest in educational opportunities, and this may be long-term, but obviously that is going to be positive in developmental terms. But we also lose opportunities because of the often informal and unregulated nature of migration. So in other words, if we think about how to manage migration better, to regulate it better for the purpose of making a positive impact on migration, we're likely to see better results. I talked about remittance transfers and how the high cost potentially reduces the development impact. One of the areas is the absence, and here I specifically want to talk about labor migration, the absence of regulatory and management policies, particularly in terms of temporary migration. So we do have, in some cases, what I guess we would call temporary labor migration schemes in agriculture and so on, but it is really not something that is broadly developed. There aren't too many examples of formal seasonal work bilateral labor agreements in the region. And I think if we do this better, if we have better regulatory and management policies for temporary migration, I think that could have a much more positive impact on development. And then, of course, issues of trafficking, processes around asylum seekers and refugees, the issue of migrant smuggling, that is one of the key areas for that the SAMM project is attempting to address. But it's really how do we respond to these? Because remember, development is not just economic, but we're also talking about the social dimensions of migration and trafficking, the abuse of the asylum process or the abuse of asylum seekers and refugees, smuggling, they all have a negative impact on socioeconomic development throughout the region. And then just one of the things is a lot of migration policy focuses on entry and exit of migrants. For us to think more broadly about migration and development, we also have to think about what I refer to as downstream integration policies. So to what extent, when you have a migrant worker or when you have a refugee in the country of destination, to what extent are they entitled to healthcare services or educational services or other social services such as housing and so on? And we see an absence. In most countries, we actually see an absence of explicit policy defining the rights and entitlements of migrants. All of this, we need better data collection, we need better research, we need better analysis. And so while there are, let me refer to it as big bodies of research. So we have a very broad information and reports on migration data, on what's happening with migration. I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is for more micro studies. And you need to balance those out because micro studies, smaller studies by themselves are not sufficient because we have to see the bigger picture. But in order to better understand the bigger picture, we do need the smaller micro studies. And as I said on Monday, this does mean engaging with migrants themselves, collecting their stories and so on. And then one of the difficulties we're dealing with is that there isn't sufficient cooperation between governments, between NGOs, between academic and so on. And so let me conclude with these 5 points. One, we do know that there is significant potential for migration to contribute to development in countries of origin and destination, but that requires further data collection and research, as I just indicated, so we can understand better what is happening with migration, how it is impacting on development in both countries of origin and destination. In 2006, some of you may be familiar with this, but in 2006, there was the first United Nations high-level dialogue on migration and development. And the slogan there, the catchphrase there was, we need to maximize the positive impact of migration while minimizing the negative impact. And that has to do with migration policy and management systems, which have to be based on evidence, which have to be based on the data that we have collected and what we know about migration. And so the better we understand migration, the better we can engage in rethinking, changing attitudes, changing perception, changing behavior towards migrants and migration, to shape it so that migration can have a much more positive impact on development. And all of this requires a whole of society approach. So in other words, it's not just governments that need to do this. It's not just academic researchers that need to do this. It's not just NGOs that need to do this, but everyone has to be involved, including the media. And so in tomorrow's session, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the media as a partner in migration and facilitating migration for the purpose of development. But we do need to understand that there are a whole range of stakeholders that should be involved in this process. And they all need to work together in order to make this successful. So I will stop sharing. I'm happy to take any questions or comments from anyone.
And my suggestion, Vincent, is that we give the floor to Theo now. Meanwhile, participants, they can think about questions they have about your presentation and to post in our chat. And we do after that we do one block for questions and answers for the whole block. So like that, because we are running a little bit late already. So we had also some reactions from the exercise we did. People shared on the chat box what they have learned also in the previous session, and we're going to have Charles, who is going to make some comments on that as well. So so what I would like to do is to give the floor to Theo now for his presentation, and after we go back with questions and answers So if you have any question, any comment to do about Vincent's presentation, please post in the chat box, and after we're going to come back to that. Okay.
So thank you very much, Fernando. Is it okay if I share my screen from this side?
Perfect.
Is this visible for everybody?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, okay. Let me just start by saying good morning to everybody again. Welcome all the participants, and great that you could make it this morning. And a special welcome also to the colleague Vincent, whom indeed I hadn't seen for we haven't been speaking for a while, although working on similar topics most of the time. What I would like to do this morning is just highlight a few points in Vincent's presentation, which I just picked up and complement and maybe augment that a little bit with what we know from the empirical research that is readily available on the economic contribution of migrants, and in particular migrant workers. So even though we know in broad terms a lot about migrants and migrant workers, the information base, the research base for the economic contribution of migrant workers is still limited. And that is why I would like to highlight a few points that that have been brought about by the available research, without going into much detail at this stage. Just one or two comments with regards to Vincent's contribution, which I think provided a solid overall overview of the role of migrants and migrant workers in the SADC region. One point that was mentioned by him is the importance of reintegration. And this has always been an issue, especially if you talk about short-term migration, workers on short-term contracts, and also workers on limited contracts. Sooner or later, they will return to their country of origin. And then it is the question is if there is a reintegration policy in place so that they can reintegrate again in their country of origin. This issue has of course become way more important in the context of the COVID pandemic, where we saw in many countries forced return of migrants and migrant workers. That also happened in a number of SADC countries, and often served as a wake-up call for governments that more needs to be done in terms of reintegration policies. And that is then obviously true in the context of COVID, but also in a structural way for migration flows in general. A second point that I would like to highlight in Vincent's contribution, he mentioned and emphasized towards the end the importance of data, the importance of research. I will get back to that in a moment, in particular with regards to research. But in a media context, it is, I think, very important to make this distinction between what we know and what we perceive. And in particular, with regard to the issue of undocumented migrants, what we often see, what in the media is reported, is perceptions. And it is interesting to note, I think, that perhaps it was a month ago that in South Africa, the statistical agency made the not so usual step, I think, because I haven't seen it that often, to openly debunk media reports about undocumented workers in South Africa. So there was repeatedly talk in the media about very high numbers of undocumented workers in South Africa. And the Director General, the Statistician General from Statistics South Africa came out to say, these reports, what is reported in the media does not align with what we see in our statistical database. There is no backing for this type of allegations. And I think this just underlines the need for organized data, organized research in the region, so that people can refer to actual facts and not just to perceptions, which may be generated by somebody saying something at a particular website or in social media, and that then is repeated many times over, and at some point seems to have become a fact that nobody is checking. So that having said, I would just like to highlight one or two points about migrant workers that we do know based on empirical research. The ILO has done a lot of research on migration and migrant workers. I would just like to refer here to a 10-country study that we have done together with the OECD, and which includes 4 countries in Africa and 2 countries in Southern Africa, including South Africa, highlighting the labor market position of migrant workers in general. And what the figure shows is that in most, if not all countries, you find that there is a relatively strong representation of migrant workers among low-skilled workers. So that there is a significant part of migrant workers is relatively low-skilled, and this is often exceeding the proportion of low-skilled workers among the non-migrant workers. That doesn't mean that all migrant workers are low-skilled, because in many countries you also see a relative over-representation, a relatively large proportion of migrant workers that have high-skilled. So you see these two elements, basically, migrant workers often overrepresented both at the low end and at the high end, which makes it difficult to generalize, to say, oh, migrants are particularly here or migrants are particularly there. But we know, that especially at the low end, the low-skilled end of the spectrum, there is a need for protection of workers. That is true for non-migrant workers, and that is true for migrant workers. And that is one of the reasons why organizations like the ILO pay particular attention to the position of migrant workers in the labor market. And that is also the link with international labor standards, which apply to everybody, both migrant workers and non-migrant workers. So this is just in terms of the labor market position of migrant workers. And the second point with regard to the economic contribution of migrant workers in general, there are often 3 questions asked about the economic contribution of migrant workers. That is, to what extent are they contributing to economic growth? And what is the impact of migration on incomes of the non-migrant population? There is often the question raised, and Vincent raised that as well, the displacement of non-migrant workers by migrant workers. And there is the issue of the contribution of migrant workers to public finance. That is, are governments paying more for migrant workers than for non-migrant workers? Now, there is no time in this presentation to go into the details. I would just like to highlight the main results of the study that we did at this stage. And the main conclusions are based on the age profile of the migrant population. That is, in most cases, you see that migrants are relatively young. They are younger than the non-migrant population, which means that immigration in general tends to raise the share of the population that is employed, because it raises the share of the working age population in the population as a whole. And the implication of this simple demographic fact is that it is unlikely that migration has a negative effect on economic growth. And many studies actually show a positive effect. In terms of labor market, in terms of displacement, as I said, we included South Africa in the study, but we found similar findings in other countries as well, that in most cases migration did not have a significant impact on labor market outcomes of the non-migrant population. So at the national level, you often did not see any displacement effects. And in a number of countries, you actually saw positive effects. So in the case of South Africa, you can demonstrate that migration actually created jobs for the non-migrant population. You can show that on the basis of empirical research, which has been done by the ILO, by the OECD, but I've also seen similar research being done by other organizations. That does not mean that it is not possible that in a particular place or in a particular area, there is competition along the lines that Vincent was also indicating, that there is competition between a migrant and a non-migrant worker for jobs. But it is not true, and you can show that on the basis of research, that generally speaking, migrant workers are taking jobs from non-migrant workers. Rather, the opposite is true. With regard to the fiscal effects of migration, we found in many countries, in particular in African countries, that the net contribution to public finance of the migrant population exceeded the net contribution of the non-migrant population. And again, this goes back in many cases to the age profile of the migrant. That goes back to the profile of the migrant population, that given that migrants are often relatively young, they're more likely to work. And if they are working, and in particular, if they're working in the formal sector, they're likely to contribute to public finance in the country of destination. Well, in many cases, they are not yet or not eligible for some of the benefits that are available for the non-migrant population. And in that sense, their contribution is even higher, than could be expected on the basis of the age profile by itself. So this just to complement the presentation so far in terms of the overall picture on the migrant population, in terms of the empirical facts with regards to the migrant worker population. And these empirical facts are readily available on the website of the ILO in the report that I'm showing here in the slide. And I'm, of course, available for any questions or queries later. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. Thanks. Back to you, Fernando.
Thank you very much, Phil. So now I was thinking about go through the questions, but I think it's going to be better to do that at the end of the session, because we have a time issue here, and Charles, who is going to do the second presentation, he has some time limitations. So what I'd like to do now is to call our break, a break of 10 minutes. So we're going to be back at 9:55 with Charles' presentation, and after we're going to come back to the questions you have wrote in the chat about this first part. Okay, so please be back at 9:55, so we have the time to finish our second part of the course, and we're going to have the time also to go through your questions. Okay, so see you in 10 minutes. So let's now continue. And in this second part of today's session, we're going to have a presentation from Charles. And now we're addressing the second part. The topic is going to be related to getting the migrants' evidence-based story right. So, so I would like to give the floor to Charles, and he has a presentation for you. And after, as I mentioned, we're going to go back and to have Vincent going over all questions you have put in the chat box over the session. So, Charles, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Merci. I'd like to remind our French-speaking participants, if they want to ask questions in French as well in the chat box, they should not hesitate. I'd be pleased to address them in French as well. I'll try to keep my presentation short. I know we have a tendency to go over time. There's a lot of content to cover, but I'll try to be as focused as possible. I won't go into the details of the questions or the remarks that have been put in the chat box since the beginning, but I just wanted to thank those who commented on the first day's presentation. I noted several of you talked about the importance of terminology and how you were interested in the first day in reflecting on the words we use when we talk about migrant workers, and how sometimes without necessarily noticing, we can use dehumanizing language. I think a lot of the challenge is here. What I'll try to do with a short presentation, an illustrated presentation, is to try and identify some of the main problems that we identify in the way the media reports on these issues. And then I'd like to invite you to think about Vincent and Theo's presentation and maybe to have the opportunity to look at them again and reread them with some time and think about what is missing in the story we tell about migration, and that features in those presentations, in the reality of migration, in the disconnect sometimes between the perception that we have and the reality of the numbers or the evidence that we can have from research. Most of the examples I'm going to share come from actually countries that are outside of the region. But this is also to say that many of the challenges that we find in reporting on migration are common across the world. I'd like to start with this picture. This is a picture of a domestic worker from Cameroon living and working in Lebanon. It's a photography that was taken by a very talented photojournalist who unfortunately passed away in a dramatic terrorist attack in Burkina Faso a couple of years ago. But she was working at the time with trying to change the perception on migrant workers. And it's true when I ask journalists, you know, what is their perception of domestic workers, let's say in Arab states, this is not necessarily the representation they would have. Someone standing up, going about with her daily life, not necessarily exposed as someone vulnerable or someone low-skilled. It's really important sometimes to look at the images that we are not seeing and to reflect on that. I'd like to start with a quote from an English senior editor of the BBC, someone who has had a very long career. And I'll read you through this quote, and I'd like you to reflect on this quote also after this presentation. He made these comments when he was reflecting about the way the media covered the first Gulf War. So it was about how the media covered a war but I think it applies very well to the way we cover migration as well as journalists and communicators. He says, when I look back, I used to think that the essence of good reporting, we could say of good communication, lay in showing people that subjects they had always thought were too complicated to understand could in fact be explained simply and easily. And you will hear a lot of people tell you migration, it's very simple, it's about this and that. Now, though, I have changed my mind. Everyone from the man beside you at the bar to the writers of newspaper editorials seems to think there is an easy answer to everything. I have come to realize that good reporting should show people that the big issues of the day, and I hope we can agree that migration in the SADC region is a big issue of the day, are usually complicated, and they require real thought. And that the simple off-the-cuff answers are often just the result of impatience and ignorance and not of understanding. And it's true, I think, reflecting on some of Theo's remark about the research on the contribution of migrants, it requires some real thought, real understanding to really grasp the reality of what the contribution is of migrants to a society. And I'm not necessarily just speaking of the economic contribution, even though it's also been demonstrated in many countries that the net economic contribution of migrants is positive. But if we look at the global history, the global cultural, social, and also economic history, most of the major positive events that have happened, positive breakthrough, have always been connected to some form of mobility. And I'd like you just to reflect also about what we're currently living with the COVID, and to remind you that the first hypothesis of a vaccine for COVID was discovered in Germany by people of Turkish background. And for those who know a little bit the German society, the media has at times been very harsh on Turkish migrants. And at the same time, when we are in the middle of a pandemic, part of the solution comes from this migration or these migration backgrounds. Another couple of quotes I'd like to run you through, and that I hope will give you some food for thought. Your responsibility as journalist is not to tell your readers what they want to know or hear. Your responsibility is to tell them what they don't want to know or hear. If you are here to please the audience and to fuel preconceived ideas, you are not necessarily playing your role. Journalists are here to give factual, documented, contrasted, impartial information. And that at times might go against the public discourse or the general opinion. And I find that very interesting that some of you have commented after Fernando's initial question that the first session had participating in changing some of your perception. If we during this couple of days are capable of changing our perception, then the next step is how, as media professional, do we help in changing the public perceptions of our readers and of our audience. The second quote I'd like to share with you is from a Lebanese writer, Amin Malouf. In French, s'émouvoir instantanément de tout pour ne s'occuper durablement de rien. What Amin Malouf says, and he says this is a typical feature of contemporary societies, is that we have a tendency to be emotional about everything all the time, but to take care of things on a long term of nothing. And it's true, we are living in societies of constant emotion. And migration is a topic where this constant emotion is very relevant. and the media has a tendency to fantasize and to dramatize a lot of the migration stories and to look for these emotional stories. But when we're moving from one emotion to another, we have more difficulties to look at the underlying basic phenomenon, to analyze them and to take care of them. Part of the challenge of this course and of the SAMM project is really to look at long-term management of migration flows, of mixed migration flows. And that requires to maybe take a step aside of constant emotion to try and look ahead. And one last comment is that we should not focus on difference between positive and negative journalism. We should focus on the difference between good and bad journalism. And what I want to say, I know that part of this program is about promoting a positive image, but we should be careful about trying to just oppose two narratives. One which would be a negative narrative about migration, criminalizing or dehumanizing, that we would want to counterbalance with an overly positive narrative. I think in Vincent's presentation on the first day, he acknowledged the fact that migration is a contrasted reality. And as journalists, what we have to strive for is to have good journalism that is connected to the reality. That's what is important. And through that good journalism that also looks for stories that are human stories, that are within the reality, we can help provide a more accurate representation of migration. A couple of pictures that will help me comment some of the challenges we face. In Spain, for about a decade now, a number of people have been working on a topic that is called immigracionalismo, which is the tendency of immigration reporting to be dramatically attracted to sensationalism. And what they are trying to fight is this general tendency to have good reporting on a number of subjects, but to kind of go crazy when we start talking about migration and to have this tendency to sensationalize. And the audience receives information about migration only when there is sensational information to be provided, and therefore has a distorted perception of the majority of what migration is about, which is not sensational stories of human beings, which is regular stories of people who have positive events in their life, negative events in their life, but just as any non-migrant would have as well. The second challenge is about stereotypes. Here I've taken a couple of cover pictures from weekly or monthly magazines from France, from Switzerland, from Morocco, but you could find them in the SADC region as well, I'm sure. And I've not necessarily taken newspapers which are really tabloid newspapers. Some of them are very respected newspapers. The first one on the left is from a French weekly. It's the one I'd like to comment first. The title is about the true cost of immigration. It's very similar to what Theo's presentation was about. In 2012, the OECD released a report about France, about the net economic contribution of migrants, which was saying something very simple, which was said within this newspaper. The fact that most of migrants in the French society are active members of the economic force, and that few of them have health situations, makes that they have tendency to have a positive net contribution to the economy. They work, they pay taxes, they contribute to the revenue of the society, and they are less in a situation where they require social or health benefits, so that they are not a strain on our health system. However, how did the newspaper decide to illustrate that? With a picture of a woman, apparently radical Muslim woman, entering into a family social welfare to get social benefits. So what was the idea behind this picture? To say that even though there is positive economic contribution, our society is losing a cultural, a religious, a social war, which is absolutely not in line with the numbers. Women that dress like this in France, you can maybe have 100 out of hundreds of thousands of migrants who contribute to the economy. So the newspaper was unable to represent the reality of the numbers. They were attracted to a sensational story that is fantasized by a huge part of society. And on the right side, the picture from Morocco is a little bit the same, the black threat. Migrants who are of black color in Morocco are a threat. And the underlying lines, they are thousands, numbers that are vague, thousands of migrants, clandestine. They are linked to drug trafficking, to prostitution. And basically, if we have problems in our society, let's not look within the society. All of the problems come from outside. And that is something we see very frequently. I'd like to move to the next slide, which is the last one, and which is the one that I would like to conclude my presentation with. This is a picture some of you might be familiar with. It won the most prestigious photojournalism award in 2013, at a time when there was very important migration flows around the world, especially of refugees related to the Syrian crisis and the Libyan crisis. This is a photography of migrants from the Horn of Africa, from Ethiopia, from Djibouti, from Eritrea, from Somalia, who are looking for signal to send one last message to their family before they embark on a journey to try and go to Saudi Arabia looking for work. They are not taking a selfie. They are looking for signal to send one last message. We know that the route from Horn of Africa to the Gulf is one of the most dangerous routes. And even though Yemen is torn in a terrible civil war, hundreds of people continue to take the boat on a daily basis. You barely hear any news about it. Why is that? Because there is a lack of journalists operating freely in that region. There is a lack of resources to send journalists from outside to investigate what is happening. And I very much like this metaphor of migrants who are searching for signal. They are trying to be heard. They are trying to send one last reassuring message to their family that they will take a trip which will maybe be the last. But they are also inviting us to reflect on our responsibility to tell the story adequately. So I would like to think, for those of you who are in Mauritius, who are in Botswana, who are in Lesotho, in Zambia, or in South Africa, who are the migrants in your societies who are searching for signal, who are trying to be heard, whose story is not being represented currently in the media? And how could you, by your efforts, by your interest, by your knowledge, and by your understanding of the reality of migration in your region, contribute to improving general awareness on these issues? So I will end the presentation here. I will share it with everyone. And now I'd like to hand the floor back over to Fernando, Vincent, and Theo, and also to give you the possibility to share your questions in the chat box and have some time for some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. I think it was a very nice presentation. And Now we're really late, so I would like to, we're not going to have time to go like over each one of the questions, but Vincent has been looking at the chat box, and I would like to ask him to, in 10 minutes, to try to basically to address the main points that were mentioned as doubts and remarks and questions. And also, I would like to remind participants that we're going to finish in 10 minutes, but these discussions can continue in the eCampus forum that I have showed you this morning. So that's a space that we have so that you can go deeper in your doubts and questions. And both Vincent and Charles, they are monitoring the forum. So if you write your questions, your comments there, so we are going to have their feedback. So that said, I give the floor to Vincent in 10 minutes to go over the main doubts.
Thank you, Fernando. Yes, there are some interesting questions that have come through. I'm not able to respond to each one of them individually, but I'm going to try and link them together. So I respond in some way to most of them. Let me start with the question posed by Gibson. And for those of you who haven't seen it in the chat, it's about migrants who irregularly get access to documents, whether those are identity documents or passports and so on. And he's saying, do we still call them migrants, or isn't there something else that we can call them? So Gibson, they remain migrants. Remember our definition of migrant the other day was someone who has crossed an international border and who are temporarily or permanently residing in a country other than their home country. So we still call them migrants, but these migrants would fall into the category of what we referred to the other day as irregular migrants, or migrants in an irregular administrative position. They are in violation of immigration law, or they are in violation of some other law. So we should be clear about that. But in essence, they remain migrants. We don't change their names, but we do recognize that they are migrants in an irregular situation because they have fraudulently accessed official documents. Toboloko asked me to expand on what I meant by lost opportunities when it comes to migration. This was in reference to, if we do not have a complete picture and a good understanding of migration dynamics and how it could potentially impact positively on development, if we do not have the appropriate policies in place, if we do not have the necessary management systems and infrastructure in place, we could be losing out on opportunities for development. And so, for example, remittances, because remittances are expensive, they tend to be informal and so on, the impact that they could have is actually reduced. So if we make it easier for migrants to send remittances back home, it means that they can probably do so more regularly, they can do so at a lower cost, they can send more remittances back home, and that will obviously have a positive impact on initially the households, but more broadly, the more migrants do this, it could have a more positive impact on the country of origin as well. And so the lost opportunity is we need to see how we can facilitate the positive impact of migration on development. Ashok asked a question which I spoke about briefly earlier, and we spoke about it on Monday as well. But this is the idea that local workers do not want to do certain jobs. And so we talked about it as dirty, dangerous, and so on. I'm not sure if it is entirely true that local workers do not want to do these jobs. The reason why they're not in those jobs is precisely because they are expected, or they refuse to work longer hours under difficult conditions for lower wages. And they are saying, we are not prepared to do these jobs for those reasons. But migrants are willing to do those jobs because for many migrants, that's the only means of survival. So in fact, they are willing to work harder and face difficult and dangerous working conditions for lower wages because they really do not have much of a choice. And so migrants are often romanticized. They're often praised for being willing to work harder for less money. I don't think that's a good thing, right? And I think that citizens have every right to complain about not wanting to do those jobs. And the problem here is not that citizens don't want to do those jobs or that migrants are willing to do those jobs. The problem here has to do with the regulation of the labor market. And earlier, I referred to the two-tier labor market, and that's effectively what that's about. That is about citizens are refusing to be exploited and to be abused. They are insisting that employers should respect and should implement labor market regulations. Migrants, unfortunately, are not really in a position to do that, which means that it's not because they're willing to work harder and they're willing to accept lower wages. Well, they are, but that's not what the issue is. The issue is this is a violation, potentially a violation of labor market regulations, and it's something that should be dealt with. So we cannot turn this around and blame citizens, saying you do not want to do these jobs. The reason they don't want it is because they refuse to be exploited and to be abused. And we should encourage migrants to do the same and provide them with the necessary support and mechanisms so that they can avoid this kind of exploitation and abuse. And then Moshe asked a question, a related question about migrants being treated more favorably. So for example, governments seem to make more effort so that migrants can have access to services, so that migrants are taken care of. And this goes to what we talked about anti-discrimination the other day. Citizens know and they can insist on their rights. They can say, I am entitled to send my child to school and you cannot tell me otherwise. Migrants have a lot more difficulty in doing that, right? So discretionary decisions are made to exclude migrant children from school, even though they have the right, by law, they have the right, they have the entitlement to send their children to school. And so government must intervene and say the authorities do not have the right to deny migrants these services. That doesn't mean that migrants are being treated more favorably. Effectively, what that means is the government is taking steps to ensure that migrants are not being discriminated against. And so this perception that governments are doing more for migrants, of course they are doing more, but they're doing more to ensure that migrants can also realize their rights. If the denial of rights is based on some discretionary action or some illegal action in many cases on the part of the authorities, it is the obligation of governments to intervene in that. Citizens generally have better access to having their difficulties resolved, so they can go and complain, they can approach the authorities, but migrants often need to be supported and assisted in order to realize the same rights. And if we don't make the extra effort, the lack of effort in fact means that we are unintentionally, in most cases, discriminating against migrants because we are not making it possible for them to access their rights and so on. Someone asked a question about getting requests from police or immigration authorities. It was Ashok as well, to cover the operations against migrant workers. I'm assuming you're referring to some other government authority or some other NGO institution. Yeah, this is about jurisdiction. This is about if there are operations against migrant workers or irregular migrants and so on, who has responsibility for that and what kind of support do they need? If it is an immigration issue, the immigration authorities need to deal with that. And if for whatever reason they need support from the police, they can invite that support. And we see here in South Africa, for example, we see those operations all the time. Where it becomes a problem is where we then mix up, we conflate what is an immigration issue and what is in fact a law enforcement or a criminal issue. So here we regularly see reports that over the weekend in downtown Johannesburg, police conducted raids and they arrested 100 criminals, including 20 undocumented migrants. And so my immediate question is, well, what criminal offense did the undocumented migrants commit, right? So criminal offense as in robbery or murder or that sort of thing. because they don't say that there were criminals that were arrested or people who engaged in criminal activity that were arrested. And in addition, there were people who were arrested for not having proper documents. And so not making that distinction feeds into this idea that all migrants, and particularly migrants in an irregular situation, are criminals as well. And so I'm making this point. It's about who is responsible for whatever kind of enforcement. And yes, we accept that sometimes a lot of the time the enforcement authorities need support and there's no reason not to help them. But in this kind of context, we need to separate out what is an immigration offense. So someone doesn't have the proper documents, or someone is engaging in an activity that the document does not allow them to do, or they don't have any documents at all. That's an immigration offense. That should not be lumped together with a criminal activity like murder or robbery or hijacking and so on. And so, yes, everyone has to work together to deal with these issues. But when it comes to assisting with immigration enforcement or with law enforcement, we do need to make the difference between what people have been arrested for and so on. So by all means, assist the police and assist the immigration authorities, but understand what your role is in assisting them. And if you are an immigration person, it is not your job to go and arrest people for committing murder and so on. Your job is to check the documents of people, but then to separate out if someone has been arrested for being in an irregular situation, report that that is the only reason why they were arrested. Don't lump them together with other criminals and so on. I think I've covered most of the questions. Yeah, if I haven't, I think participants can feel free to either type in the chat box or, with your permission, Fernando, to maybe take the floor to ask questions or comment.
We really are over time now and we have to finish. So I would like to thank you very much, Vincent, for addressing the questions. And again, to remind all that you have the forum in the eCampus where you can deepen those conversations. So let's use this space so that we can take our discussions further. And with that, I'm going to finish today's session. But before, I would like to thank all speakers, Vincent, Charles, Theo, to thank also Alex for the management of the Zoom interface, and to especially thank our interpreters who really today did a great job. And again, they kept here longer than they should with us. So I really would like to thank them and to recognize this work they're doing. So I would like to remind you that our next session is tomorrow, again starting at 8:30. So see you all tomorrow. Have a nice day and see you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, colleagues. Thanks, Fernanda.
Everyone. Bye.
Thank you. See you tomorrow. Merci à tout le monde.